Julia held the headset firmly, trying to stay focused as the auditorium filled up. The echo of English voices and the hurried footsteps of the staff blended with the sound of her racing heart. It was just another simultaneous translation, or at least that's what she kept telling herself. But something felt different that morning. The tense atmosphere among the executives, the impatient gaze of the CEO, everything seemed on the verge of collapse. She adjusted the microphone under her chin and fixed her eyes on Ethan Caldwell, who entered in his dark suit and usual cold demeanor. Judging by his expression, it wouldn't be an easy day. Ethan was late, which made him even more irritable than usual. Presentations with international investors demanded precision and absolute control, two things he valued as sacred principles. When he saw Julia in the translation booth, he frowned. "Her again?" he muttered to his assistant. It wasn't that he thought she was incompetent. He just didn't like depending on anyone, especially someone whose voice could expose him if she slipped. To him, translators were like glass, transparent and silent. They shouldn't interfere. The conference started promptly with formal introductions and carefully worded speeches. Julia performed her job flawlessly, translating every technical sentence with surgical precision. Ethan spoke about innovation, growth, metrics. But there was something in the presented charts that didn't make sense. Julia noticed it while translating the quarterly projections for the investors. The comparison between quarters was off. A figure had been duplicated. A small mistake, but a risky one. None of the surrounding executives seemed to notice. She hesitated. Translators don't give opinions. They just deliver. That's the first rule of the job. But in that moment she knew. Staying silent would mean translating an error that could cost millions and the trust of international investors. As the audience waited for Ethan to finish his sentence, Julia took a deep breath and did the unthinkable. In a calm, professional tone, she briefly interrupted the translation. "Gentlemen, I apologize, but there is an inconsistency in the presented data. The quarterly comparison doesn't match the submitted report." Silence. Utter silence. All eyes turned toward the booth as if an invisible wall had just shattered. Ethan stopped speaking, eyes wide, stunned by her audacity. Julia knew exactly what she had done and what might follow, but she held her composure. The head of the foreign investor group, a gray-haired German, raised an eyebrow. He asked to see the report, verified it. She was right. Ethan had to take a deep breath before continuing. After the conference, the backstage air felt like shattered glass. Julia quietly gathered her equipment, bracing for the storm. Ethan stormed down the hallway and stopped in front of her, jaw clenched. "You took it upon yourself to correct me in front of my investors?" he fired. She looked him straight in the eyes, refusing to bow her head. "I stopped you from losing international credibility." The tension between them could have set the room on fire. He didn't reply, just stared at her for long seconds as if deciding whether to admire her or hate her. Then he turned and walked away. Julia stood there, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She knew she wouldn't be called again, might even end up blacklisted by the company. But she had done what she believed was right, and that brought her inner calm, even if it came at a high cost. That night, trying to relax in her tiny apartment, the entire episode replayed in her mind like a film. Every word, every flicker of Ethan's expression, every second of tension. Her conscience was clear, but her professional future was a question mark. Deep down, she wondered whether he was the kind of man who learned from mistakes, or who retaliated when challenged by someone like her. A mere translator. The next day, to her surprise, the company called. "Mr. Caldwell would like to see you in a private meeting this afternoon," said the voice on the line. Julia nearly dropped the phone. She'd expected to be shut out, not summoned. Still, she agreed. She had a strange feeling in her chest, as if stepping into an arena. She didn't know if she was about to be punished or acknowledged. The meeting room was empty when she arrived, but the panoramic view of the city reminded her of the vast gap between his world and hers. Ethan entered shortly after without a greeting. He simply sat and opened a laptop. "You're good at what you do," he said at last. "But it's not your place to speak out of turn." Julia remained calm. "And losing an investor out of pride would be your place, Mr. Caldwell?" He stared at her coldly. "You exposed me," he retorted, still smarting from the blow to his ego. "I protected the project," she replied. Silence returned, thick with tension. Beneath his arrogance, Julia saw a man who didn't know how to handle mistakes or women who didn't lower their gaze. His eyes were full of conflict. For the first time, someone had challenged his absolute control. And yet he didn't dismiss her. On the contrary, he said, "You'll continue as translator for upcoming events, but no improvising." A punishment disguised as an opportunity. Julia simply nodded. She knew she was still being tested, but now she had something he couldn't ignore. A voice. And for the first time, he seemed torn between anger and respect. Leaving the meeting, she wasn't sure what to think. Ethan kept her close, but with suspicion. She noticed the constant judgment in his eyes, as if waiting for her to slip so he could strike back. But there was something else. Something even he hadn't yet identified. And that made every interaction between them tense and unpredictable. Julia returned to work in silence. But now, even in silence, she was noticed. Ethan passed her with brief glances as if studying her. She was no longer invisible, and that was dangerous. At the next conference, he didn't even say her name, just, "She translates." But a single look between them was enough. She knew the story was just beginning. Even as the voice in the background, Julia was stepping into a space of influence no official title could define. She knew the CEO better than most of his team, because she had seen his mistake, and because she had dared to speak. Ethan might try to deny it, but she knew, and so did he. In the following days, Julia noticed something curious. Ethan looked at her during the conference's backstage moments as if trying to decipher a code. There was no warmth in his gaze, but no longer any disdain either. He seemed unsettled by her presence, unsure of what to expect. Julia, in turn, remained strictly professional, never once apologizing for what she had done. But inside her, a strange mix of adrenaline and anticipation brewed. The fact that he hadn't removed her was proof enough. She had been heard, and, even if he never admitted it, she had shaken something inside him. During an internal company meeting where she had been asked to translate only technical documents, Ethan appeared unannounced. He sat silently at the back of the room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Julia pretended not to notice, but every cell in her body was on alert. He seemed to be measuring her every move, every word. When the meeting ended, he followed her down the hall. "Have you always been like this, or did you just get brave that day?" he asked suddenly. She stopped, turned to him, and calmly replied, "I've always been like this. You just hadn't noticed." That night, for the first time, he thought of her outside the workplace. Not as a background voice, but as a woman who stood up to him and made him reflect. Ethan Caldwell wasn't easily impressed, much less inclined to let someone make him question his own actions. But there was something about Julia, something unsettling and magnetic. She wasn't just efficient. She had a mind of her own. And, worse for his ego, she had been right. Even if she irritated him, he was starting to admire her for it. Julia couldn't stop thinking about Ethan either, not for his charm or looks, though he was handsome, but because of the inner turmoil she sensed in him. A man used to always being right who didn't know how to deal with someone who stood up to him without fear. She didn't want to get involved. She knew that world was volatile, full of egos and hidden agendas. But something inside her recognized the cracks behind his coldness. And maybe, just maybe, there was a man there trying to learn what it meant to truly listen. At the end of that week, Ethan called Julia to translate at a private dinner with foreign executives. "You're just the interpreter. Understood?" he said firmly. She nodded, but when one of the executives made a flattering remark about the company and Ethan responded with veiled sarcasm, Julia hesitated. When translating, she softened the "oh" tone. Ethan looked at her in surprise. She hadn't challenged him. She had protected him, and he understood the message. She knew when to speak and when to stay silent. The dinner was over, but Ethan kept replaying the moment Julia softened his response in her mind. It was a simple gesture, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't understand the weight of a translation. But to him, it was revealing. She had spared him, subtly, with intelligence and control. There was no arrogance in what she did, no desire to show off. It was pure discernment, and that unsettled him. Because he was beginning to realize that she was anything but disposable. The next morning, Ethan called his assistant. "Put the Translator on my schedule permanently. I want her at every event involving international matters. The assistant hesitated. Julia? He nodded curtly. Yes, and tell her this isn't a favor. It was his way of saying he trusted her, without having to admit it. When Julia received the message, she didn't know whether to smile or be on guard. The man who had once accused her of overstepping now wanted her close. Always. Their professional proximity intensified. Meetings, business lunches, investor gatherings. She was there for all of it. Discreet, poised, observant. But something had shifted between them. Ethan could no longer ignore her presence. He started to look for her gaze at key moments, to notice her silent reactions, to anticipate her thoughts. And it distracted him. After all, he was the kind of man who thrived on control. But Julia was the exception to his rule. One afternoon, during a break between meetings, Ethan approached the table where Julia was reviewing technical documents. "Do you always read everything this carefully?" he asked. She looked up, calm. "Someone has to care about the details." He wasn't sure if her words were a challenge or a sign of respect. Maybe both. He sat beside her uninvited. They started talking, not about business but about language, culture, books. For the first time, he saw her as a woman. After that day, her presence became more than a convenience. It was almost a need. Ethan realized he could only truly relax amid the chaos when she was nearby. Her voice anchored him. The balance between her firmness and calm fascinated him. And slowly, he began to open up. Personal comments, unscripted observations, barely there smiles. Julia noticed, and though she tried to protect herself, she was being moved too. During an event in Boston, Ethan and Julia stayed at the same hotel. After a formal dinner with executives, they walked back silently along the lit sidewalk. "You know, you're different from anyone I've ever worked with," he said suddenly. Julia gave a soft laugh. "Because I speak when I shouldn't?" He smiled slightly. "Because you speak when no one else would dare, and stay silent when you know that's wisdom too." It was the most sincere compliment he'd ever given. That night, Julia had trouble falling asleep. Something had changed. Ethan was no longer just the man who had mentally fired her at their first conference. He was revealing himself. Slowly, reluctantly, but still revealing. Even so, she kept her feet on the ground. She knew how volatile this world could be, where power and emotion often blurred. But she also knew how to recognize when someone was trying to change. And Ethan seemed to be trying. Back at the office, the tension between them became quieter, heavier. It wasn't discomfort, it was anticipation. During a legal department meeting, a translation error by someone else caused a serious impasse. Ethan, without hesitation, turned to Julia, who hadn't even been part of the meeting, and called her in. "I need your help." It raised eyebrows, but she entered, translated, and resolved the misunderstanding with a grace that disarmed the entire room. Trust grew, and with it a kind of affection that didn't fit any job description. Ethan began to see the world through Julia's eyes. He started listening more, speaking less. His team noticed the shift. Some thought it was just a phase. Others believed he was interested in her. But no one dared say it aloud. The CEO was changing. And the reason had a name and a voice. Julia. One evening, Ethan showed up in the translation room with 2 coffees in hand. He handed one to Julia without a word. She took it, surprised. "You brought coffee?" she asked. "I thought you might translate it as recognition." She smiled, and the silence between them felt easy. For the first time, they weren't defined by roles. Just 2 human beings trying to understand each other. The atmosphere between them was like a tightrope, tense, but full of meaning. Neither of them made a move, but neither pulled away. They were in a new space where respect mingled with curiosity. Julia, despite staying professional, knew something was building. And Ethan, though resistant, was beginning to realize she was the only person who truly saw him. At a dinner with French investors, a cultural misunderstanding nearly derailed the negotiation. Before Ethan could respond harshly, Julia stepped in with a thoughtful explanation. The mood shifted. The evening was saved. When it ended, he thanked her with a gentle squeeze on her arm. "You protect me more than you should." She simply replied, "It's my job." But they both knew there was far more behind those words. One afternoon, as Ethan left the building, he saw Julia being greeted warmly by a former college classmate. She laughed, relaxed. Ethan stood still, watching. He realized how much he wanted to know her outside controlled environments. Not as a translator, as a woman. And that disturbed him more than he cared to admit. He couldn't hide his jealousy when she came back inside. The next day, he was colder than usual. Julia noticed. "Something wrong?" she asked. He said no. But it was clear. The line between professional and personal was beginning to blur. And that scared him. After all, she wasn't someone easy to manipulate. She was independent, full of integrity. And he didn't know how to love without control. That would be his biggest battle. Julia, on her side, also questioned herself. She didn't want to repeat old patterns with powerful, emotionally unavailable men. But Ethan seemed different, still guarded but with visible cracks. And despite all her inner warnings, she began to hope he would have the courage to go further, to shed his pride, to allow himself to feel. The following week, Ethan invited her to a strategic alignment lunch. The restaurant was upscale, but intimate. Still, the conversation quickly drifted into personal territory. "Have you always been this calm?" he asked. "No. Life forced me to be," she replied. And in that moment, he saw the vulnerability behind her strength. And it disarmed him even more. After lunch, they walked in silence toward the car when he asked almost timidly, "Do you think I've changed?" Julia gave a soft smile. "I think you've started to listen, and that's already a start." Ethan said nothing. He wanted to say more, but couldn't find the words. He only knew one thing. He wanted to become someone worthy of her gaze. That Friday, a new conference was scheduled. And this time, Julia wasn't just the interpreter. She was involved in the executive team's strategic preparation. Ethan was the one who recommended her. "She sees what no one else sees," he explained. The board raised eyebrows but agreed. Julia entered the room knowing that from now on, no one could ignore her. When the conference ended, the French CEO approached Ethan and said, "You're lucky to work with someone like her. Smart, articulate, and loyal." Ethan only responded with a look. But inside, something was blooming. Julia was no longer just the voice in the background. She was becoming the center, and he knew he couldn't deny that anymore. That night, in the now empty office, Ethan watched Julia organizing her papers. She said goodbye with a polite, "Good night, Mr. Caldwell." He hesitated. "Julia." She stopped, turned around. He wanted to say something. To confess, maybe. But all he managed to murmur was, "Thank you. For everything." She smiled. And in that smile, there was a silent promise that the best was yet to come. The relationship between Ethan and Julia had reached a fragile point. It was no longer just professional, nor entirely personal. They were walking a fine line where any misstep could break everything they had built. Julia felt the tension rising with every encounter. Ethan seemed to want to get closer but always pulled back whenever he felt vulnerable. It was as if something inside him still fought to maintain control. And Julia, as much as she admired him, didn't know how long she could wait for him to lower his guard. It would take more than glances and gratitude. The following week, Ethan scheduled an important presentation for new investors. He insisted that Julia participate not just as an interpreter, but also in the strategic preparation. It was the first time she had been included so directly. She was surprised, but accepted. It felt like she was finally being recognized beyond the technical role. However, during an alignment meeting, something happened. One of the executives questioned Ethan's proposal, and before she could speak, he cut her off. "Julia, please, just translate." The silence in the room was immediate. The humiliation was subtle, but deep. Julia felt her face flush. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. The way he had put her back in her place in front of everyone. She took a deep breath, kept her composure, and continued working. But inside, something cracked. After everything they had been through, after all the trust she thought she had earned, did he still not fully respect her? Or worse, did he still need to assert his power in front of others? Ethan realized the weight of his words too late. He saw the light vanish from Julia's eyes, saw her body close off. But he didn't apologize. Not in front of the team. And, later, he didn't have the courage. Too much pride. Too much fear of seeming weak. In the days that followed, she remained professional, but distant. No more coffee breaks. No more small talk. He missed it. And more than that, he felt guilty. But he didn't know how to fix it. Julia, in turn, started to question herself. Was she letting her feelings interfere too much? Was she expecting something from Ethan he couldn't or wouldn't offer? She didn't want to be just another woman enamored by a powerful man. She wanted respect. And in that moment, she felt diminished. She decided to focus on work and guard her emotions. If he wanted to earn back her trust, he would have to prove it with actions. The presentation took place on a Friday. Julia was impeccable. She translated with fluidity, articulated with brilliance, connected ideas and people. Everyone noticed her value, except Ethan, or at least he didn't show it. When it was all over, the investors praised the brilliant communication partner. He merely nodded. Julia thanked them alone. That was the breaking point for a silent decision. She would start looking for new opportunities. The following week, she received an offer. A French tech company invited her to join their international division with full recognition of her abilities. A fair salary. A space where her voice would be heard. It was tempting. But before accepting, she chose to be transparent. She walked into Ethan's office and handed him the printed offer. "I thought you should know I'm considering new paths." His expression changed immediately. Ethan read the paper carefully. The silence stretched far too long. "You're leaving?" he asked. "Maybe," she replied. "Not for lack of opportunity here, but for lack of real space and respect." He leaned back in his chair, clearly absorbing the impact of her words. "You know you're valuable to me, Julia." She looked him in the eye. "I know I'm useful, but I don't know if I'm respected, and that difference matters." He wanted to respond. To say he respected her more than anyone else, that he admired her, thought about her outside work, couldn't go a day without noticing her absence. But all of that stayed stuck in his throat. Instead, he said, "I need time." Julia nodded, steady. "I don't." And she walked out. That conversation shattered him. For the first time, Ethan Caldwell realized he might lose someone who truly mattered. That night, he didn't sleep. He revisited every decision, every word said and unsaid. Remembered the first day she corrected him in front of investors, the first dinner, the coffee, the quiet smile when she corrected him with grace. And now, the look of disappointment. He was losing not just an employee, but the only person who saw who he truly was, and still chose to stay. Or had chosen, until now. The next day, Ethan called an emergency meeting with the executive team. Once everyone was seated, he did something unexpected. He apologized, not just to Julia, but to the entire team for his recent behavior. He admitted he had been arrogant, that he'd let his ego lead important decisions. Many sat in silence, shocked. Julia kept a neutral expression. But something in her eyes softened. After the meeting, he asked to speak with her privately, this time with humility. "I know I was wrong. I won't ask you to forget it. But I'd like to ask for a chance to do things differently." Julia crossed her arms. "Why now?" He took a deep breath. "Because this week without you showed me everything I've taken for granted, and I don't want to go on like this." She didn't reply right away, but for the first time, she believed he truly wanted to change. In the following days, Ethan began showing through actions what words couldn't express. He gave her a permanent seat in strategy meetings, recommended her for international training programs, started listening to her more even when he disagreed. Julia, cautious, kept her distance at first, but slowly, she began to see something different. A man trying to learn, failing, stumbling, but trying. One overcast afternoon, after an especially long meeting, Ethan walked with her to the elevator. "Still considering that offer?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "But for the first time, I'm not in a rush." He smiled slightly. "I hope you'll choose to stay. There's still so much I want to show you, Julia didn't answer, but the look she gave him said more than words. During a conference in Spain, Julia was applauded at the end for her clarity and articulation. Ethan, standing beside her, looked proud. After the room emptied, he approached her. "You were brilliant," she smiled. "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "If I ever get in your way again, let me know. Because now I want to lift you up." Julia felt her heart race. They were finally in sync. Over time, the air between them grew warmer again, but with more maturity. Now there was mutual respect, room for voice, and above all, truth. Ethan learned to lower his guard, and Julia learned it was possible to trust someone who allowed themselves to grow. They weren't in a relationship yet, but they were building something real. And that was worth more than any impulse. At an event with international leaders, the CEO of a global corporation publicly praised Ethan's brilliant communication advisor. Ethan responded firmly, "She's not just my advisor, she's the mind behind the best decisions I've ever made." Julia felt her face flush but didn't look away. Their eyes met for a moment, and in that glance they understood. Something new was beginning. On the way home, Ethan dropped her off at her building as usual, but before she stepped out, he took her hand. "Julia?" She looked at him surprised. "I'm still learning, but I want you to know, I'm trying because of you, because you taught me what no one else had the courage to say." She didn't reply immediately, but she smiled. A smile that said, "I see you," and for now, that was enough. The next morning, Julia arrived at the office earlier than usual. There was a note on her desk. "Meeting at 9 a.m. Room 4, trust me, E." She frowned, curious, but went. When she entered the room, she found a small team, Ethan at the center, and a new planning board on the wall. "We've decided to create an International Strategic Impact Committee, and you're going to lead it." Julia stood in stunned silence. "Are you serious?" Ethan nodded. "Never been more sure. You don't just translate, you transform." In that moment, Julia realized something had changed for good. It wasn't just about job titles, meetings, or recognition. It was about having a voice. About finally being seen and heard by someone who used to equate power with silence. And the most surprising part was that the change was coming from Ethan. He was making space for her, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. For the first time, Julia felt she could stay, not because she had to, but because now she truly belonged. The new committee led by Julia brought fresh air to the company. New ideas, human connections, and more sensitive expansion strategies began to emerge. Ethan watched her closely, not just for the results, but for the way she inspired respect, without ever raising her voice. Her leadership was different from his. It didn't control, it guided. He admired that. And deep down he wished he could be more like her. But something held him back. An old weight. A past he kept buried. Julia also sensed that Ethan was still hiding something. As much as he had changed, and he clearly had, there was a shadow. Behind his gaze, a constant fear of not being enough. One evening after a long meeting, they were left alone in the glass-walled room. The city lights sparkled outside. Ethan stared at the horizon, his brow furrowed. "You always seem so centered," she remarked. He gave a slight smile. "Just practice, inside, not so much." Julia realized it was an invitation. She moved closer, sitting beside him on the couch. "You can trust me, Ethan, if you want to talk." He hesitated, as if standing before a door long locked. "I don't usually talk about the past. I don't think it's useful." Julia held his gaze. "Sometimes the past explains who we are, or what we're afraid to become." That struck something in him. For a few seconds he looked vulnerable, and then he began to speak. Low, slowly, as if still testing whether he could trust her with it. "My father was CEO before me. A hard man. Demanding. Always told me that emotion was weakness and leadership required coldness." Ethan's voice deepened. "I never heard 'I'm proud of you.' Just pressure. When he got sick, I took over. But I also took on his way of being. I hid behind the same armor." Julia listened in silence. She didn't interrupt. Just listened. And that for him was rare. "I grew up thinking I had to be invincible to earn respect," he continued. "But you showed me it's possible to be firm without being cruel. to listen without appearing weak. He gave a bitter laugh. When I humiliated you in that meeting, it was fear. Fear of seeming smaller than you. And you were greater, Julia. Because you had the courage to be yourself even in a place where no one expected you to have a voice. She swallowed hard. Julia gently took his hand. I'm not greater, Ethan. I just had nothing to hide. You had to fight more than I did. He looked at her, surprised by the compassion. But you don't have to be your father anymore, you're not him. He fell silent. For the first time, she saw his eyes fill with tears. But he blinked them away quickly, as if not yet ready to allow that. Julia didn't push. The fact that he shared it all was already a step. After that night, Ethan began to trust her more. Not just in meetings, but with parts of himself even he didn't fully understand. Slowly, the two developed a kind of intimacy that required no declarations. It was built through gestures, through silences that soothed, through looks that said, I'm here. But the corporate world wasn't kind to vulnerability, and soon the rumors began. Some directors began to suggest that Julia was only rising because of her closeness to the CEO. She heard it in the hallways. Ethan heard it too. The gossip enraged him, but she stopped him from acting rashly. We don't need to prove anything to anyone. Our work speaks for itself. He admired her even more, but it became clear. If they wanted to move forward, they'd have to stand with even more integrity. And they were ready. One morning, during a board meeting, one of the senior members subtly implied that the International Committee felt too personal. Ethan responded immediately. The committee was built on merit, and Julia is the most strategic mind we have. That implication is disrespectful, to her and to me. The room fell silent. Julia felt warmth rise in her chest. For the first time, he didn't protect her in silence. He defended her in public. After the meeting, she stepped into his office. Thank you. Ethan stood, approaching slowly. You never needed me to defend you. But I needed to show I'm no longer afraid to stand beside you. Julia looked at him for a moment. Standing beside me is easy in here. What about out there? He understood the weight of that question. It wasn't just about work. It was about owning what they were building, without hiding. The following Saturday, Ethan invited her for a day outside the city. No events, no executives, just the two of them. They strolled through a botanical garden, had lunch at a simple place. No badges, no formality. For the first time, Ethan laughed freely. No tension in his shoulders. Julia saw him as a man, not a CEO, and he saw her as the woman who taught him that being human is, indeed, a strength. On the drive back inside the car, he held her hand. You have no idea what this means to me, what we're living. Julia turned to him, smiling. And you have no idea how much you scared me at first. They both laughed. It was light, it was new, and it was real. What began with resistance now flowed naturally. But they knew new challenges would come, and they'd need to be ready. During an international conference in Paris, Julia was invited to give a talk on strategic communication. Ethan watched from the front row. At the end, she received a standing ovation. As he approached her, he embraced her, not as a CEO, but as a man. You shine even when you try to stay in the background. Julia laughed. And you've learned to admire that. It was the first time they shared a gesture of affection in public. When they returned to the hotel, Ethan asked her to join him on the balcony. The city glowed at night. You know that weight I used to carry? He said. The guilt, the fear, the past. You helped me leave it all behind. Julia stepped closer. And now? He smiled. Now I want to discover what's possible, when we lead with heart. She rested her head on his shoulder. And there in silence they sealed a promise that needed no words. The next morning, still in Paris, Ethan and Julia had breakfast on the hotel terrace. The city was waking slowly, and for the first time in a long while there was no rush in their movements. You know what impresses me most about you? He asked. You're not trying to impress anyone. Julia smiled, stirring her coffee gently. Maybe because I spent a long time just trying to survive. When you learn the value of your own peace, the need to prove things fades away. Ethan sat silently, taking in her words like a truth he didn't know he was missing. Back at the company, The two continued working side by side, but now there was a quiet understanding between them. There was no need to hide or rush. The relationship growing outside the office was discreet, but real, and that gave strength to everything they were building together. Julia maintained her impeccable professional stance, but the glances they shared carried more than recognition. They carried care, admiration, and a quiet affection that, no matter how contained, had become impossible to ignore. At the opening of a new branch of the company, Julia was invited to cut the ribbon alongside Ethan. It was his idea. "You're part of this achievement," he said, looking her in the eyes. She hesitated for a second, then accepted. In the photos, they stood side by side, hands close, subtle smiles. The press didn't miss it. The next day's headlines referred to them as the duo leading the company's most human transformation. It was public recognition of what had long been clear behind the scenes. Together, they were powerful. That night, Ethan took her home, not as CEO and translator, but as a man and woman who had learned to admire each other through pain, mistakes, and rebuilding. Sitting on the porch beneath a clear, silent sky, he gently touched her hand. "I never thought I'd meet someone who'd teach me more than the greatest mentors in my life," Julia smiled. "And I never thought I'd hear that from you." It was there, without promises or grand plans, that they shared the truest kiss of their lives. The kiss wasn't rushed, nor impulsive. It was calm, deep, filled with everything they had held back for so long. It was as if all the unspoken words finally found their way. As they pulled back, Ethan leaned his forehead against hers and whispered, "Thank you for staying." Julia simply replied, "You finally gave me a place worth staying." And in that moment there was no doubt. What they were building was love, slow, real, rooted in choice. In the days that followed, the routine continued with the same professional commitment. But now there was a new ease between them, a bond that transcended titles and roles. The respect that had always been there was turning into partnership, and that partnership into affection. Ethan no longer made decisions alone. He consulted Julia, he listened, and more than that, he applied what he learned from her. The company grew, but more than that, it flourished, and everyone could see. Behind the company's new chapter were two people who had chosen to grow together, not above each other. The change was subtle but visible. Ethan arrived at the office lighter, and Julia, though still reserved, radiated a different kind of calm. There was a quiet energy between them, built on lingering glances and small gestures only someone in love would notice. The more observant employees picked up on it. There were no excesses, no out-of-place intimacy. But there was something that inspired. Because together, they became the image of how power could be transformed into purpose and admiration into real affection. Their leadership wasn't just efficient, it was human. On a rainy afternoon during a strategy meeting, one of the new directors asked Julia whether she came from the translation or planning department. Ethan interrupted before she could respond. She came from where the ideas that changed the course of this company were born. The room went silent. Julia simply smiled. She no longer had to fight to be heard. He made sure of that. And in that moment she realized she had reached a place no title could measure, a place where she was valued as a whole. Weeks passed, and the international project she created continued to expand. At every presentation, Ethan gave credit to her work. The two of them were more united than ever, in mission, in values, and now in heart. They had yet to publicly acknowledge their relationship, not out of fear, but out of respect for timing. Ethan wanted to do it right. Julia needed to know she wasn't being protected, she was being chosen, and so, in the silence of shared decisions, their love grew. One Saturday, Ethan took her to visit the countryside where he'd grown up. He showed her his father's old house, now abandoned, and spoke about things he had never told anyone. Julia listened attentively, but what touched her most was seeing him without armor. "You don't have to be perfect to be loved, Ethan," she said, gently holding his hand. He closed his eyes for a moment as if those words had found a place in ruins for years. And that day, something within him was rebuilt. On the way back to the city, Ethan stopped the car outside her building. But this time, he got out with her. He went upstairs, had coffee with her in the small kitchen, and sat on the simple sofa where she read at night. Surrounded by books and quiet, he said, "I feel more at home here than in any of my properties." Julia smiled, resting against his shoulder. It was the kind of intimacy that demanded nothing but presence. And presence was what they gave each other most. At work, invitations to high-profile social events began to arrive. Ethan, once used to showing up alone, started inviting Julia as his guest. At first, she declined. "I don't want to be seen as decoration by your side." But he insisted. "You're the reason I changed. I want people to see that." She gave in. And at that first event, everyone could tell she wasn't just his date. She was the woman he looked at as if everything made sense when she was near. At that event, a journalist discreetly asked Ethan whether Julia was part of the strategy or of the heart. Ethan replied with a quiet smile, "She's the wisest part of both." The phrase quickly spread backstage. Some found it bold, others brave. But everyone understood. The once feared solitary man was now someone learning how to share. And sharing was the noblest form of leadership. The next morning, Julia walked into the office to discreet smiles and respectful glances. She knew the news had spread, but she didn't feel embarrassed. On the contrary, she finally felt her journey was no longer invisible. Ethan greeted her with coffee in hand as he always did now, and he whispered as he handed it to her, "The only thing that matters to me is that you keep being here, by my side, in everything." During a board meeting focused on expanding the company's social project, Julia presented impact data with clarity and emotion. At the end, the board president praised her presentation. Ethan added, "And she's not just an excellent professional, she's the most admirable woman I've ever met." It was the first time he used the word woman publicly, and personally, when referring to her. Julia looked at him. It was no longer a secret. It was a statement. That night, alone in the office, Ethan stood by the window and called her over. The city's never looked this beautiful before. Julia joined him in silence. He turned her to face him, held both her hands, and said, "Julia, I know this all began with a translation, but what you did was translate me to myself. And for that, I want to share my life with you." Her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't an official proposal, but it was already the promise of a love that finally could be seen by everyone. Julia didn't reply right away. She simply leaned, her forehead against his, and smiled. "You've become someone I can admire, Ethan, and that's worth more than any declaration." He pulled her into a strong embrace as if trying to confirm she was really there. And she was. After so many conflicts, fears, and silences, their love now had space to exist freely. Not rushed, not hidden. It was the kind of love built over time and daily choice. The following week, a special feature in a business magazine highlighted the company's new phase. More human, more strategic, more ethical. At the center of the article, a photo of the two of them walking together after an event. The headline read, "The Power of a CEO Who Learned to Listen, and the Woman Who Taught Him More Than Numbers." When Julia saw the article, she laughed. "That's not what I had in mind when I corrected that graph," Ethan replied. "That's exactly why everything started to change. The public recognition didn't change how they treated each other. Their gestures remained simple, their exchanges honest, their boundaries discreet." Ethan started joining the team for lunch more often, listening more to employees. Julia kept her routine steady, unimpressed by prestige. But now she felt free to be herself, without having to stay guarded all the time, because by his side, there was space. And, more than that, there was mutual respect. One afternoon, the two visited one of the company's partner NGOs together. Children ran to Julia, calling her by name. Ethan watched with admiration. A little girl approached and said, "You're the lady who makes him smile, right?" Julia laughed, surprised. So did Ethan. But that tiny voice held an enormous truth. He smiled again. Because yes, Julia made him smile. Inside and out. Back at headquarters, Ethan asked her to stop by his office before she left. Julia walked in and found an envelope with her name on it. Inside was a document. International Co-Executive Leadership Plan Proposal for Julia M. She looked up, confused. "You want me to?" Ethan nodded. "I want you to share everything with me. The leadership, the projects, the mission, And if you want life too. Julia stayed quiet for a moment, then smiled. So now it's official. With her new role, Julia began representing the company at international forums alongside Ethan as co-leader. The press started calling them the duo of transformation, but to them, it was simpler than that. It was just two people who chose to rebuild together. Ethan no longer needed to prove anything, and Julia, at last, had earned recognition without compromising who she was. For Julia's birthday, Ethan prepared a simple surprise. A dinner on her apartment balcony, soft lights, stacks of books as centerpieces, and a playlist of her favorite songs. When she arrived, she smiled in disbelief. "You did this?" He held out a glass and said, "I listened. Everything you love, I paid attention to." She was moved, because in the end, that was it. He had learned to listen to her, and listening was love. That night, between laughter, wine, and confessions, he pulled a small box from his pocket. Julia's eyes widened in surprise. "It's not what you're thinking. Yet," he said with a sly smile. Inside the box was a simple pendant with the word voice engraved on it. "Because it was your voice that saved me." Julia held the chain, her eyes brimming. It wasn't just a gift, it was a milestone, a reminder of all they had overcome. At the end of that night, sitting on the balcony floor, wrapped in a blanket, and surrounded by tiny candles, Ethan said, "I used to be the man who told people to be quiet. Now, I'm the man proud to listen, and all because you didn't stay silent." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder, silently. She didn't need to say anything, because he finally understood everything. No translation needed. Their love was no longer hidden or feared. It was a visible choice, conscious, real. And together, leading a company and inspiring people, they kept writing a new story, not of power, but of listening, transformation, and partnership. Julia and Ethan were now more than a couple. They were proof that when someone finds their voice and someone chooses to hear it, everything can change. Not every great love story or transformation grows in a straight line. Sometimes it takes just one misstep to shake everything. And that's what happened when one of the corporation's major partner companies announced it was ending its contract with Ethan and Julia's firm. The reason? A clause overlooked by a negligent manager, unnoticed in the most recent negotiations. The company, now under media and market scrutiny, needed a quick response. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility, instantly, but the worst part wasn't the crisis. It was the fear of falling back into old patterns. The boardroom became a battleground. Advisors, directors, lawyers, everyone speaking at once. Julia, once again, remained calm. She observed. She listened. Until Ethan, already exhausted, asked, "Julia, what would you do?" It was the first time, during a crisis meeting, that he handed leadership to her. She took a deep breath. "Before we act, we need to own the failure. Transparency is our only chance of maintaining the trust of our other partners." There was resistance, but Ethan nodded. "We'll do it her way." Within hours, the communications team drafted a clear and accountable statement. Julia personally reviewed it. Ethan signed it without changing a single word. It marked the beginning of a new posture, acknowledging mistakes and acting with integrity. Even so, the damage was considerable. Losing the partner would impact quarterly goals and directly affect the international division. The board grew uneasy. And as always in these moments, scapegoats emerged. And Julia became the eye of the storm. A leaked internal email mentioned the co-director's excessive influence over the CEO. In side meetings, some board members whispered that Ethan had fallen in love and lost focus. When Julia found out, the ground shook beneath her, not from shame, but from injustice. Everything they had built with ethics and honest leadership, now questioned with malice. Ethan was furious. "I'll call the board and set everything straight." But Julia stood firm. "We won't react with pride. We'll respond with truth." Still, she knew something between them would change. Not the love, but the pressure. The way the world still punished women who held power and were involved with high-profile men. Julia didn't want to become an excuse for the company's mistakes, and even less, allow Ethan to carry that guilt. Silently, she began to consider the unthinkable, stepping back temporarily from her executive role until things settled. It was painful, but perhaps necessary. That night, Ethan showed up at her apartment, eyes weary. "Are you going to leave me?" he asked, before even stepping inside. Julia didn't know how to answer right away. "I don't want to, but maybe the company needs it right now." He stepped closer, gently holding her face. "You're not the problem. You're the answer they don't understand yet." She smiled sadly. "And sometimes, the answer is what scares people most." Ethan didn't want to lose her from the team, but he respected her decision. He knew forcing her to stay would be silencing her choice. The next morning, she submitted a formal memo announcing her temporary leave. It wasn't a resignation, but the effect on him was devastating. Watching Julia pack up her notebooks, her files, her favorite mug, hurt more than any lost contract. She didn't leave defeated. She left with dignity, but she left a void. The following weeks were hard. The company kept running, but something was missing. Ethan tried to keep up with the routine, but the spark was gone. Meetings became mechanical, decisions automatic. Without her presence, everything seemed less clear. The numbers began to recover, but he did not. Because even with financial recovery, Ethan felt he had lost the soul of the new chapter they had fought so hard to build. Meanwhile, Julia took the time to reflect. She went on short trips, reconnected with old friends, returned to writing in her journal. But deep down, everything led back to the same point. Ethan, not just the man she loved, but the man she had seen change. And that, she believed, was worth fighting for. But she needed to be sure he would stay on the path of truth and listening, even without her there. And she needed to see it with her own eyes. 1 month after her departure, Ethan's name appeared on a list of nominees for a Leadership Ethics and Business Transformation Award. Julia saw the article while having breakfast. She smiled to herself. He was moving forward. He was honoring everything they had built. And in that moment she knew, maybe it was time to return. Not as a shadow, but as light. As a presence that should never have been questioned. On the morning of the awards event, Ethan was more nervous than he would admit. He put on his dark suit, adjusted his tie, but something was missing. Or rather, someone. He checked his phone repeatedly, but no message came from Julia. In the car on the way to the theater, he felt a silence inside that no applause could fill. When he got out, journalists surrounded him. He answered politely, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. As he stepped onto the stage to accept the award, applause filled the packed auditorium. Ethan thanked the audience, spoke about integrity, transformation, and leadership that listens. Then he paused. "But everything I'm saying was only possible because someone had the courage to challenge me. And even more, to believe in me. Julia, if you're listening, this award is yours too." A murmur swept through the crowd. And backstage, hidden among the support team, Julia's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't expected to be mentioned. She had come quietly, without telling anyone, just to watch him. But that public, direct, vulnerable gesture was all she needed to be sure. When the event ended, she slipped away discreetly. But Ethan saw her. He ran after her before she could leave the building. "You were here?" he asked, breathless. Julia smiled, shy. "From the beginning, I just wanted to see with my own eyes who you had become." He touched her face. "And what did you see?" She didn't hesitate. A man who learned to deserve. They walked together through the streets, still buzzing from the event. No more speeches. No more justifications. For the first time in weeks, everything was quiet between them, and yet so full of meaning. Ethan stopped in front of a flower shop still open. He bought a single flower. Simple. You don't need bouquets. Just truth. She took the flower gently, and she knew. It was time to return. Days later, Julia's return to the company was announced in a closed meeting. Not as someone coming, back in Ethan's shadow, but as co-director with full authority and strategic visibility. Even the board's harshest critics couldn't deny that her absence had cost more than her presence ever could. With the calm only the truly principled carry, she took her place once again. No revenge, no ego, just presence. The team gave her a standing ovation when she entered the meeting room. Ethan said nothing in that moment, he simply stood. She sat beside him like before. But now, something had shifted. They weren't just defending a project or an idea anymore. They were defending a way of being, a way of loving, a way of leading. And that was stronger than any crisis. In the following weeks, the company went through internal restructuring. Julia led trainings on ethics, active listening, and human communication. Ethan stood beside her, sharing his journey without hiding his mistakes. "I didn't change alone," he often said. "And I wouldn't have changed at all if I had stayed silent when someone showed me a better path." That inspired others. The company's new culture had a name: Truth. On the company's anniversary, a public celebration was held. Ethan made a point of opening the event alongside Julia. Before, this company was known for goals. Today, it's known for impact. Before, for numbers. Now for names. And it all began with a woman who wasn't afraid to speak. Julia, emotional, gently held his hand. And in that gesture, there was more power than any applause. When the event ended, Ethan took her to the rooftop. The same place where months before he had promised to share his life with her. He held her hands and said, "I'm no longer the man who asked you to be silent. I'm the man who now listens to you, learns from you, and chooses you." Julia smiled. "And I'm no longer the woman who needed to prove her worth. I'm the woman who chooses to be where she's fully seen." Then, they kissed. Without hurry, without fear. The crisis didn't break them. It shaped them. And the love born from confrontation survived the world's pressure, because it wasn't made of appearances but of presence, of courage, of words spoken at the right time, and silences honored when needed. Julia and Ethan now knew, to lead is to listen, to love is too, and together, they would turn that into a legacy the world would never be able to silence. The new phase of the company was more than just a strategy. It had become a culture. Ethan and Julia, now officially recognized as co-leaders, built a management model rooted in listening, social impact, and human relationships. Profit didn't disappear, but it became a result, not the ultimate goal. Employees felt the change. Meetings that used to be tense now included pauses to hear personal stories. Metrics still mattered, but the names behind them began to matter more. Julia proposed a groundbreaking initiative, creating a foundation connected to the company, focused on empowering women in technical fields, communication, and leadership. Ethan embraced the idea enthusiastically. "Let's give back to the world what the world almost kept us from becoming," he said during the official announcement. The project was called Living Voices, a tribute to how it all began, and to the courage of not remaining silent. The response was immediate. Partners joined in, investors offered support. The impact was quick to follow. The first class of the project gathered 20 women from diverse backgrounds, single mothers, immigrants, professionals who had been overlooked. Julia led the sessions with firmness and empathy. Ethan watched, moved. Seeing those women gain confidence, find their voices, it was like watching the same transformation he had gone through. In one session, a young woman approached Julia and said, "If you manage to change the most feared CEO in the country, maybe I can change my own life." As the foundation gained strength, the company continued to thrive in a steady and sustainable way. International magazines praised the rare blend of performance and purpose. But what touched Ethan and Julia most was seeing the faces of those impacted. Nothing was more rewarding than hearing real stories of new beginnings, independence, and growth. They didn't want an empire. They wanted a legacy, something that would remain even when their names were forgotten. Outside the corporate world, their relationship matured too. No longer wavering between fear and passion, they lived in the calm of choosing each other daily. They shared time, books, ideas, and even silence. Ethan, once restless, found peace in her gaze. Julia, once guarded, felt safe beside him. There was no longer fear of loss, only gratitude for what they had found. During an international event in New York, Ethan was invited to speak about transformational leadership. He stepped onto the stage confidently but went straight to the point. "I'm not here to teach, I'm here to share what I've learned." And then he spoke about Julia, not as a romantic partner, but as a symbol. "She taught me that power without listening is just tyranny in disguise, that results without respect build nothing. And sometimes listening to someone is the most revolutionary act you can do." The audience gave him a standing ovation. And backstage, Julia cried, quietly, not because she needed the recognition, but because she knew how far he had come to stand on that stage. When he came down, they met behind the curtain. Ethan held her face and said, "There's no greater achievement than listening to you and choosing to change." Julia, voice thick with emotion, replied, "And there's no greater love than watching you choose, every day, to be better than you were." Back home, they attended the graduation ceremony of the Foundation's first class. Each woman who stepped on that stage was proof that the project wasn't about Ethan or Julia. It was about every voice that had been set free. When the ceremony ended, they remained alone in the empty auditorium for a few quiet minutes. "Remember how all this started with a messed-up chart," she said, laughing. Ethan smiled. "And with a woman who had the courage to say what no one else dared to." Julia looked at him lovingly. "We've become something I never imagined, not just a couple, but a team, a mission." He stepped closer and took her hands. "And I want that mission to continue, beyond these walls." She frowned slightly, curious. Ethan pulled a small box from his pocket. There was no ring, just a key. "It's the key to a house I bought. Not as a symbol of possession, but of building. I want to build something with you. A life. A home." Julia held the key gently. "You're not asking me to move in? You're asking me to stay by your side no matter where we are, right?" He nodded. "Exactly." She smiled, tears filling her eyes. "Then yes, Ethan, I accept." They embraced right there on the quiet stage, among rows of empty chairs, surrounded by the remnants of an event that had changed so many lives. And once again, without grand gestures, they sealed their most important commitment to continue together, serving, listening, and transforming. The following week, the house that had been just an idea became real. A simple place, full of open windows, books on every shelf, and a backyard garden, planted together on Sundays. It wasn't a mansion, but it was home. A place where Ethan hung his suit by the door, and Julia spread her notes across the dining table. There, they weren't titles, weren't headlines. They were just two people learning to share life with more listening than promises. Ethan learned to wake up early just to watch Julia writing in silence, her hair carelessly tied up, a mug of coffee in hand. And she learned to recognize his effort, to be more present, more affectionate, more gentle each day. The arguments still happened, but they ended with listening, not silence. Their relationship had matured. It was a partnership without impositions, built on freedom and the continued desire to choose each other. At the launch of the Foundation's second hub in another state, a reporter asked Ethan what legacy he hoped to leave behind. He looked at Julia before answering. "I want to be remembered as someone who had power, but chose to listen. And if anyone ever writes my story, I hope it starts with, he changed because he had the courage to listen to a woman no one expected to speak." Julia gently squeezed his hand. And that was everything. Over time, other couples in leadership began to emerge, inspired by their journey. Men learning to make room. Women realizing they didn't have to give up their voice to love. Ethan and Julia became a quiet reference, proof that yes, success can go hand in hand with sensitivity. That true power lies in sharing, not controlling. No grand speeches, just consistent actions. The media tried to turn them into icons. They declined. "We're just people trying to get it right," they'd say. But they knew something had taken root. In the company's hallways, in the Foundation's classrooms, in the eyes of the women now training other women. It was a movement. And they knew. They couldn't control where it would lead. But they could keep nurturing the roots. With truth. With presence. One night, after returning home from a long conference, Ethan stopped on the sidewalk, looking up at the sky. If my father could see me now, I don't know what he'd say. Julia came up behind him, wrapping him in a gentle hug. Maybe he wouldn't understand, but I think you became what he never had the courage to be. Ethan took a deep breath. And you are someone I never imagined existed. She smiled. Funny, I was here the whole time just waiting for someone who knew how to listen. That conversation stayed with them. Because they realized their legacy wasn't about numbers or marketing impact, it was about relationships. about second chances, about building spaces where people didn't have to shout to be heard, and most of all, about using your voice not to dominate, but to lift others up, and that was a revolution deeper than any expansion plan. At the one-year anniversary celebration of the foundation, each woman took the stage to share her story. At the end, one young woman said, "If I speak with confidence today, it's because one woman taught me that our voice can change rooms, and one man showed me that even the most powerful can still learn." Ethan and Julia were moved to tears. That moment was like a mirror, the silent harvest of everything they had planted with courageous choices. That night, lying together, on a hammock in the garden, their feet entwined and crickets singing in the background, Ethan whispered, "You know what I'm most proud of?" Julia, eyes closed, replied, "What?" He smiled, "Not silencing you when I had the chance. And loving you, even when it would have been easier to walk away." She opened her eyes and looked at him with warmth. "You didn't love me despite my voice. You loved me because of it. And that's what makes us last." They fell into silence after that. A beautiful silence, full of peace. Because there were no more doubts, no more fears, no more masks. There was only the certainty that the life they shared was already the greatest legacy of all. A legacy built on listening, truth, and love that transforms. Years had passed since the first confrontation between Julia and Ethan, the day a mere translator dared to challenge an untouchable CEO. That moment now lived only in the subtext of the choices that followed. So much had changed. And yet, the essential remained intact. Listening, admiration, presence. They were no longer two young people trying to fit into the corporate world. They had become bridge builders between people, classes, silences, and futures. The house they lived in had become a place of meaningful gatherings. It welcomed former students from the foundation, friends, authors, and even small business owners who received mentoring from Ethan and Julia. Nothing about it was flashy. The decor blended antique furniture with photos of transformative moments. At the center of the main shelf, a framed quote that marked their journey: "To love is to listen until the other recognizes themselves in their own voice." That phrase had come on an ordinary night and stayed forever. At the foundation, a new project was taking shape, a public speaking and communication school for youth from underserved communities. Julia led the planning with bright eyes. Ethan, by her side, handled the logistics. There was no longer a strict line between work and life. They had achieved something rare, living what they preached, loving what they built, and turning every plan into a shared reality. During a talk at a university, a student asked Julia a direct question: "Do you still love Ethan even after everything you faced together?" She smiled, thoughtful. "More than in the beginning, because now I know him deeply. I love even the parts that aren't easy. I love him because we kept listening, even when we didn't know what to say." The audience applauded, and Ethan, seated in the back, had tears in his eyes. She had understood him, and stayed. On the way home, they spoke little, but when they stepped through the door, Ethan pulled her into a long embrace. "I still get emotional when you talk about me, because I know how careful you are with your words." Julia chuckled softly. "And I know how much you've learned to respect every one of them." They laughed together, and in that laughter was the freedom of those who no longer needed to prove anything or hide their scars. They had become permanents for each other, not because of time, but because of choice. One quiet weekend, Ethan found Julia sitting in the garden, writing. She handed him a notebook with a new idea, a book about female voices that changed companies. "I want to tell real stories, about women who weren't heard for years, but who, when they finally spoke, changed everything." Ethan held the notebook and read each line carefully. "This book needs to exist, and it needs to begin with your story." Julia shook her head. "It begins with many. Mine is just the first page." The book was published months later and became a reference. It won awards, was translated into several languages, and became a documentary. But more than the success, what moved Ethan most was seeing how each woman felt seen in those pages. At a book signing, an elderly woman with gray hair told Julia, "You wrote what I lived, I just never knew how to say it." Julia held her hand and replied, "Now you've been heard. And that changes everything." That same week, Ethan was honored by a global network of leaders for his work in human transformation within the corporate environment. In his speech, he made sure to share the award with his team and with Julia. "If one day I'm asked how I got here, I'll answer with a name. And the sound of a voice I almost silenced, but that saved my life by insisting on being heard." The audience stood to applaud. Julia rose too, clapping with her hands, her eyes, and her heart. They were no longer celebrated just as a couple. They had become a symbol of a new kind of leadership, more sensitive, more truthful, more human. But between the two of them, none of it went to their heads. Their routine remained simple: quiet dinners, lingering glances, and notes left on the desk. Greatness lived in the details: the way he made her coffee without asking, the way she adjusted his tie before every meeting, the comfortable silence of those who know each other beyond words. At the 15-year anniversary of the foundation, they held a special event with talks, conversation circles, and tributes. But the highlight of the evening was when Ethan and Julia were asked to share one final sentence for the young people beginning their journeys. They looked at each other, smiled, and Ethan said, "Listen with your heart. Even the quietest person has something precious to say." Julia added, "And if one day you're the one who needs to speak, don't be afraid to become the change yourself." After the event, as the guests said goodbye and the auditorium lights dimmed, Julia and Ethan remained seated in the last row. They looked at the empty stage as if it were a mirror of their past. "Did you ever imagine this when you stood up to me in that first meeting room?" he asked with a half smile. Julia sighed. "That day, I just wanted to be heard. I never imagined we'd go on to hear so many other voices together." Ethan held her hand. "You're the best translation my life could have found." She looked at him tenderly. "And you're proof that even the harshest words, when truly heard, can lead to transformation." They sat there a while longer in silence, a comfortable silence full of stories that no longer needed to be told, because they had been lived, because now, everything they were spoke for itself. Back at home that same night, Ethan found an envelope with his name on the dining table. Inside, a handwritten letter. It was from Julia. "If you ever doubt what we are, read this." He sat down and began to read. Her words spoke of growth, forgiveness, listening, and love. But they ended with a simple sentence: "I didn't choose you because you were perfect. I chose you because you decided to learn, and to learn with me." He placed the letter in a special box, along with old notes, the first copy of the book, and the dried flower from the day she said yes to returning to the company. Each item was a memory, not just of happy moments, but of victories built through mutual listening. The life they had now was made of small decisions that together created something enormous. Permanence. A permanence without shouting, without empty promises. Just presence. Months later, the foundation inaugurated a new space, a center for active listening, with rooms for counseling, reading, and group conversations. On the main wall, engraved in golden letters, a quote: "To listen to someone is to recognize their existence." The authorship was collective, like everything they did. Ethan, standing beside Julia, cut the ribbon with steady hands and emotional eyes. He knew that this was the future, and the legacy. That night, sitting on the porch of their home, they watched the full moon in the clear sky. Ethan said, "You know, I used to think leaving a legacy was about being remembered. But now I know. It's about making a difference while you're still here." Julia rested her head on his shoulder. "And planting seeds that will sprout in silences we haven't even met yet." They sat there, breathing the present, at peace with everything they had been and all they were still becoming. And so, without grand announcements, without spectacular endings, their story became what it was always meant to be: a mature love, built with listening, respect, and daily choices. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that's why it lasted. Because true permanence isn't shouted, it's built. In the margins, in the gestures, in the conversations that cut through the rush of the world. The couple that began among corporate tension and cold boardrooms now flourished among books, voices, and gardens. Ethan and Julia kept transforming spaces, but more than that, they kept transforming each other. They grew, they fell, they started over, but they never stopped listening or loving deeply. And that's what made this story one that stays. If one day someone asks who they were, They might not find headlines or biographies, but they will find names written in letters, foundations and hearts that were touched, because their love was never a spectacle. It was presence. It was translation. And more than anything, it was listening. And sometimes, all the world needs to change is someone brave enough to speak, and someone willing to listen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Like the video if you believe in the power of true listening. Share it with someone who needs to be heard, or who taught you how to listen. Tell us in the comments. What quote from this story will stay with you? Stories that move you. Stories that remain. Welcome to our channel.